Good Sunday morning, Lakey Follow Christian Church. You know, it's a beautiful time of the year. I just love the fall. And for the first time in a long time, it feels a little cooler out there. So we're getting there. I would like to ask you to pray for Wayne Skaggs, if you would, please. I know that Wayne spent some time in the hospital this week. I'm waiting to hear some of the final results of what the doctor said. I would like to ask you please to pray for Dawn. Dawn has gotten into poison ivy, and you all know how miserable that is. So he's going to the doctor today. Please pray for he and Sharon. We're going to talk about Matthew 23. This is, as we've been talking about the last week of Jesus' life, what we're going to talk about today is going to be his last public sermon that he gives. And when you think about what would be the last thing that you would suspect someone would say when they're getting ready to leave this earth. Hi, Claudia. You would think, well, maybe they're going to talk about something about salvation, about loving you. Well, he's been talking about those things for 3 years. So here you go. This last sermon that he gives is going to be one that's going to be scalding, and it's going to be about the Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees are the very ones who proclaim to be the experts in religious law. They're the ones that put themselves up as being greater and holier and smarter and better than any other person who studies religious law. So consequently, Jesus doesn't like that, because all of us are the same in the eyes of God. It's just that some of us come to Christ and some of us don't choose to do that. That's one thing that he's really talking about, is that you can listen to the words and you may be interested by the words, but if you don't act on the words, then they really haven't helped you, have they? And so, let's look at this chapter 23. Right, the thing we talked about last week was verses 5 through 12. And that was where it talked about the religious leaders who did everything for show. Everything they did was ostentatious. That, in other words, they were going to make a huge presentation of themselves and how awesome they were. So they wore little prayer boxes on their heads. They wrapped straps around their arms and had attached a little prayer box to it. They would loudly wail and cry out on the street corners. They have a fringe that's broad and wide and longer than anybody else's fringe on their robes, because they're calling attention to themselves. So people will say, oh, well, you must really be a good Christian, because you do things in such a way that you must really serve God. That's exactly what Jesus is criticizing them about. And then, it goes on, and he talks about how they love to sit at the head table, and they love to receive the respect of other people. They love to be called rabbi, because rabbi is considered a teacher who is much wiser and more knowledgeable than anybody else. And then he says, don't address anybody on this earth as father. Now, he doesn't mean don't call your daddy your father. He's talking about father in the sense of spiritually, anybody on the standard is your Father who is in heaven, because there's no one greater. There's only one God. And he says, the greatest among you is the servant. In other words, those who set themselves up high and brighter and bigger and bolder and more knowledgeable than others, he says, the greatest one is going to be the one who just says, I'm your servant, Lord, and does whatever that they can do to further the kingdom of heaven. So that's what we talked about last week. And now today, very briefly, we're going to talk about verses 13 through 36 in Matthew 23. And what I'm entitling it is The Woes of the Pharisees. And it's a list of criticisms to those who set themselves up as the highest and the best and the smartest religious leaders on earth at that time. And so Jesus warns them. And, this is in the form of, guys, you better listen. But, he's just telling them, this is how it is. Now, I've heard people before say, oh, so Jesus hated them? So Jesus is going against his own message of loving other people? No, Jesus hates sin. Jesus hates it when people use their religion to set themselves up as something higher and holier than anybody else. They're better than anybody else because of their religion. And so that's what Jesus hates about it. If you want to really dig in and study about, the woes of the Pharisees, I was going to tell you where they're located. In Luke, it's located in Luke 11:37 through 54. Of course, in Matthew, which is where we are, it's in Matthew 23, and it goes all the way through verse 39. In Mark, it's in chapter 12, and it goes 35 through 40. Now, Jesus is going to start these 7 woes, and some people say it's actually more, it's 8 woes. There's a little bit of difference between Matthew and Luke, because Matthew's going to talk about woe to you who take advantage of the widows, because the Pharisees did take advantage of the widows. What they would do, or supposedly, this is historic, this is not in scripture, this is historical documentation that says that the Pharisees would go to the home of a widow after she lost her husband. Now, I want you to remember that widows and women in that time had absolutely no rights. So they couldn't own land, and once their husbands died, they had to rely on their children or somebody in the family to take care of them, because they had no means of making a living for themselves. So they would go to the homes of the widows, and they would say, well, we will pray for you. And the more money she gave them, the longer they would pray for her. In other words, you want a 5-minute prayer, you want a 10-minute prayer, you want an all-day prayer. Well, then you need to pay accordingly to what kind of prayer you want. That makes Jesus furious. Why wouldn't it? I mean, that's extortion in the name of religion. Okay, so Jesus is saying, woe to you, or what sorrow awaits you. Because, in fact, when you say woe is going to be a sadness. It's going to be when you're saying something that is a passionate cry of sorrow, because it's so wrong. And he says, woe to you, what sorrow awaits you, you teachers of religious law and Pharisees. This is verse 13. You hypocrites. Now, what's a hypocrite? It's somebody that wears a mask. On the outside, they look wonderful. They've got it all together. They're perfect people on the outside. On the inside, they're falling apart. But they're still acting like they're perfect people. They're not tipping their hand. Everybody thinks they're perfect people. Okay, so you shut the door to the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You don't go in yourselves, and you don't let others go in. In other words, you're teaching religion to other people, but you're false teachers. You're teaching them the wrong way. So not only are you keeping yourself out of the kingdom of heaven, you're keeping the people that you're teaching out of the kingdom of heaven. What an incredible, horrible thing. Now, verses 13 through 36 of this chapter are and form the most horrible, the most terrible, the most sustained denunciation in the New Testament. And it's of the people, the very people who say, we're spending our lives for you, Lord. We're giving our lives to you, Lord. But in fact, they're giving their lives to something that causes them to have great power, and it causes them to be able to control people. But they're not doing it for God. They're doing it for themselves. So this is, as I said, this is the last public sermon that Jesus is going to give in his life, because he's going to die, and it's going to be on Friday. And it's going to be these very people in the crowd. It's going to be these very Pharisees that he's talking to that are going to be sure that he dies. So I'm going to give you, in a nutshell, what those 7 different woes are. And basically, the first one is that, I just read it to you. They will not enter the kingdom of heaven themselves, and they don't let other people in either, because they're teaching them falsely. Number 2, that they preach God, but they convert people to a dead religion, not a living religion. God is a living God. He's not a dead God. So it's false faith. It's false teaching. Number 3, he's saying, and this is where they're talking about swearing an oath by the temple, and some oaths hold and some oaths don't hold. And he's saying he's leading people into a man-made positions. They taught the law, number 4, but they did not practice it. So they practiced every detail of the law in public, but they ignored people and what their needs were, and they failed to take care of others. And then number 5, they kept up appearances, but inside they fell apart. And then number 6, they exhibited themselves as righteous on the account of being scrupulous keepers of the law, but in fact they were not righteous. Their mask of righteousness hid a secret inner world of ungodly thoughts and ungodly feelings. They acted spiritual, but they covered up their sin. And then number 7, they professed a high regard for the dead prophets. Okay, well, who are those? That's Abraham, and that's Moses, and that's David. And those prophets of old, they held them up on a pedestal. But in fact, it says they would never have persecuted and murdered prophets, when in fact, this is what they say, when in fact Jesus said they were cut from the same cloth as the persecutors and murderers. They too had murderous blood in their veins. He says they're whitewashed tombs. This is the time of year where they're coming in for the Passover, and they would go out and whitewash the tombs, so people would be very careful not to touch them, because they're afraid a Gentile might touch one of their tombs and that would defile it. So everything's painted white. On the outside it's beautiful. On the inside it's full of dead bones. That's what he's saying to them. You're dead on the inside. On the outside you're white. You're painted. This morning I got a real reminder about what this is talking about. It was talking about the cup. Once you can't clean the cup on the inside, because it looks clean on the outside, but it's not clean on the inside. He's talking about their hearts. He's not talking about a cup. This morning, my cup looked really clean. I had a nice, pretty cup of coffee in it. When I drank it, I felt something in my mouth. Well, guess what? There was something filthy and nasty in my coffee cup I couldn't see. This is what he's talking about in your heart. By the way, it was a fly that dive bombed in there. So I had to pour that out. Okay, so he's talking about, take care of the inside of your heart. Don't just let it be for show and be on the outside. I would tell you, and I'll just make this correlation real quick and then I'm out of time. The door to your heart, it doesn't, for Christ, the doorknob is not necessarily on the outside of your heart. The doorknob for your heart is on the inside of your heart and can only be opened by you from the inside to let him in. Think about it. If you don't want Jesus in your life, he won't come in. He's a gentleman. He only comes in where he's invited. If you don't invite him in, he'll go away. I want to read you something. This is from Song of Solomon. I love Song of Solomon. We always think of it as a love story like Harlequin romances or something. But in fact, it's a beautiful love story, and it has a correlation to the love that you have for your God, for Christ. And so I want to read to you from Song of Solomon 5:2-6, and I want it to really resonate on your heart this morning, if you would, please. It starts with verse 2. It's talking about this woman. There are two lovers that are in Song of Solomon. She said, she's gone to bed. She said, I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with dampness of the night. So her lover has been walking around outside. He's knocking at the door. He wants her to let him in. But here's what she says. I've taken off my robe. Must I put it on again? In other words, don't make me get dressed. It says, I have washed my feet. just, must I soil them again? In other words, if I walk from here to the door, I'm going to get my feet dirty again. And so, she's in there hashing out all the reasons why she's not going to let him in the door. My beloved thrust his hand through the door latch opening, but he couldn't get in because he's a gentleman and he didn't beat the door down. He just thrust his hand in. She says, okay, I saw his hand, so my heart began to pound for him. I arose for my beloved. Of course, she puts on her robe. She dips her hands with myrrh. She's piddling around is what she's doing, getting ready for him. And she goes to the door and she opens it. But my beloved had left. He was gone. My heart sank at his departure. I looked for him, but I did not find him. I called for him, but he did not answer. In a nutshell, oftentimes we know that Christ is right there for us at any time, that he'll accept us no matter who we are. All we have to do is come to him and give our lives to him. And sometimes when he's at the door knocking and we say, oh, yeah, well, yeah, I'd like to go to church, but, I have to clean up, I need to get my hair done, and we piddle around. He leaves us to our own devices. And he asks, and he's there. And if we don't follow through, sometimes we never find him. That's what the Song of Solomon is telling us. When your lover comes to the door, and your lover is Jesus Christ, let him in. Let him in the door of your heart. This is what Revelation 3:20 says. Here I am. This is Jesus talking. I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice, open the door. I will come in. I will eat with that person, and they with me. Guys, I hope you have an awesome Sunday. I hope that Jesus' words will resonate in your heart and in your mind, and that you will love him more, and that you will open the door, and that you will allow him to come in the door of your heart. Have a great Sunday. Love you guys. Talk to you later.